think of a particularly narrow road and how difficult it is to negotiate one of these big trucks down a narrow road. Well, there is one particular company, an oil company, that is training its drivers for this very sort of thing.
Now, all of us, when we see a lorry in trouble straddled across the road, say, oh, of course it jackknifed. Well, it might well have done, but a jackknife is not the only kind of problem that the driver of the heavy goods vehicle can find himself in. There are lots of others. We're going to have a look at them. Let's start, though, with the jackknife. Now, there are two sorts of jackknife. The first one is one that's only recently been discovered. It's a power jackknife, and it looks like this. The simple cause of this type of jackknife is driver frustration. Drivers in a lorry bowling on the motorway behind a load of other lorries. He decides that he'd like to overtake. So he accelerates and starts to pull out. The rear wheels of his tractor lose adhesion. He immediately panics and hits the brake with disastrous results, because now the trailer takes over the story and simply pushes him along. But the power jackknife is relatively uncommon. Let's look now at the ordinary, nightmarish jackknife. What happens in a jackknife is that the trailer carries on in a straight line. It is the cab which moves offline and ends up tucked round the back of the trailer. Very, very unpleasant thing indeed. Why does it happen? Well, let's take a for instance. Let's suppose that you or I are pulling out of a side turning. We see a big truck come along and we think, yes, I've got enough room to get out. Truck driver doesn't think so. What does he do? Bangs the brakes on. The front of his tractor, that's the bit of the front, the driving thing, digs into the ground like that. Trailer still pushing along merrily behind. It will tend to lift the driven wheels, that's the rear wheels of the tractor. Tractor begins to move offline, tucks under, and is pushed along, dragged along by the trailer following on behind it, with frightening, terrifying results, both for the freight on the back, for the cab, and of course for the driver. Imagine a situation in which one of these trucks is coming down a hill, maybe on a bend, it's unladen and it's in the wet. Some kind of emergency comes along, the driver bangs on the emergency brake. What we now have is the situation in which the trailer tries to overtake the tractor. An unladen trailer weighs 6 tons. It's easy to see how you get a 6-ton flail whizzing round and demolishing absolutely everything in its path. That's trailer swing. Then there's loss of steering. Again, this is a condition caused by wet road and heavy braking. Tractor and trailer are moving along, some emergency happens, the brakes are banged on, and the driver finds that he has no control over his steering. And he will continue to have no control over his steering for just as long as he keeps the brakes on. He can get his steering back quite simply by releasing the brakes, but then he has to remember one vital thing. That steering will pick up at the point at which he last left it. In other words, if he's been struggling to correct this thing with the brakes on and no steering, as soon as he lets the brakes up, he might discover that he's got a 16-ton monster moving along on full lock. Imagine what the results of that would be. Finally, there's the whole question of braking distances. Now, we all know that braking distance increases the faster you go. Believe it or not, one of those big trucks will stop if it's traveling along at 20 miles an hour in its own length. If you don't believe me, take a look. You see, it really does work. Now see what happens when that same truck is moving along at 40 on a wet road. Frightening, isn't it? And of course, it could be you or me squashed underneath those wheels. So much of it could be avoided. All we have to do is to remember the sort of problems that the driver of a vehicle like this is up against every day of his working life.